commission, the commissioners, and especially the new commissioners who are bringing new thoughts, new stakeholder concerns, new opportunities forward. The Great Lakes Protection Fund is a fascinating example of exactly what John has been referencing, is that there's a multitude of Great Lakes institutions. Anyone new into North America says, huh? Why, what? And what I want to touch on to build on John's thoughts is what it is that drives us toward harmonization of institutions, and what is it where there is inestimable, irreplaceable value in independence and separation of mission and operation, and how do you work with those two seemingly conflicting but actual drivers of harmonization and integration. Those of you who were at the shed a year ago when the governors and the governor's representatives met with the board of directors of the Great Lakes Protection Fund will remember the key theme there in the annual meetings with governors and the board members of the Great Lakes Protection Fund is how do we ensure there's no daylight between the shared objectives of governors and the operations goals of the Great Lakes Protection Fund. And you saw that in practice last year, because for the governors, their Great Lakes Protection Fund is a source, a permanent source of innovation that supports groups doing work on Great Lakes issues, but where they're trying things and taking significant risk that very few institutions could afford to take and get away with, taking great risk on people trying things on the landscape so that we find out new approaches that can be changing how real money is spent, how real decisions are made throughout the region. The context here is really important. Remember that there's about 15 billion plus money spent on the Great Lakes water annually by local, regional, private, federal sources. What the Great Lakes Protection Fund has to add in terms of money is about 0.03% of the annual spending on Great Lakes water. So it's not about the money. It's about what is it that the governors say is unique about this institution, and why did they design it like they did. The board members who are elected by the governors have three main jobs. The first is to invest the public money put at the disposal of the Great Lakes Protection Fund that John referenced. 7 Great Lakes states have placed $81 million of public money in the Great Lakes Protection Fund board's hands. Now that public money cannot be spent by the Protection Fund, it can't be touched, it can't be indirectly spent. So from day one, that money has not been touched and never will be. It's the job of that board to invest that money somewhere really easy, say like Wall Street, and invest that public money so that the corporation has access to corporate funds that result from those investments. To date, the board has accomplished the following on the investment end. They have increased the endowment so that its purchasing power is staying consistent with the role of a permanent endowment, up to 120 some million. So 81 up to about 120, and they've moved an additional $120 million out. And their job is to move it out in 2 different directions. One is to make sure that individual state governors and their states can invest in their own state priorities, so that within any one state, the governor gets money from the fund that he or she, working with The rest of the legislative and executive branch can determine what are the highest priorities, use the money as they see fit. And what's important about this stream of money, we've turned over $47 million directly to the states, and the Protection Fund and its board members have no role in how that money is spent. That is state money to be spent at state discretion. So none of that is going through external review, none of that is going through prioritization, and none of that goes through our evaluation process, and none of that is audited in the end by the Protection Fund. That money goes directly to the states. Then, instead, there's investing, there's sending out the state share money, and then there is using the money over which the board does have discretion to support regional project teams, one-time teams brought together to try something on the landscape in a new way that can be game-changing to make the Great Lakes healthier. So the mission is improve the health of the Great Lakes. The methodology is one of fostering innovation. And the Protection Fund as an entity doesn't speak for anyone, does no private fundraising, does not go for any more legislative money. So since it does no fundraising and does not go back for permission to operate, but is supposed to operate permanently, it can operate quietly and let its grantees and its project teams speak for it in terms of results and accomplishments. So far, there have been 35 governors, members of the Protection Fund. So they are the private members of the private corporation. If it were a for-profit, those would be the shareholders. They elect the board members each year. There have been 67 board members to date. The investment returns to date, right about 7% annual average since the beginning of the fund. And given the vacillations of Wall Street, that's pretty good number. Those of you who are running 401ks, if you're like me, you'd be pretty happy decade in and decade out to come in at 7%. The fund has received about 1,050 applications for project team funding and is obliged by its articles of incorporation to use external technical review, so that the board's decision-making is informed by a broad range of input. As a result of that, there have been 261 awards made by the board of directors in their third area of operation, which is supporting the regional project teams. So we've been asked for $338 million roughly to date. 72 million has been awarded. Great Lakes Commission is one of the largest recipients. Project teams run by the Great Lakes Commission over the years have received in excess of $3.1 million from the fund. So the total dollars out, about 120 million out, 120 million still in the endowment. With details of projects in the portfolio right now, I've put at each of your places a Protection Fund brochure where you can go shopping for information in greater detail about what institutions and individuals have been involved in Great Lakes projects, what's out now, what's the characterization of our current portfolio. At any one time, we have usually between about $12 and $15 million worth of regional project activity underway. And that number stays pretty stable through the year, so it's a predictable, stable source of revenue that varies not largely over the years in terms of amount of work underway, amount of institutions and people involved in the project teams. One thing that I want to ask of all of you to think about as I finish this presentation and talk about some of the interest areas of the future that I really need your help with. I was handed a really great quote that draws all kinds of thought forward about the settlement of North America and the governance of the Great Lakes region, and I've been totally unable to figure out how to work this into my remarks. And so when I finish and ask if there are any questions, it is essential that at least one of you have a question that will allow me to give the following as an answer. Are we ready? This is former Prime Minister Gordon Brown. He ran part of the British Empire for a while. That is, involves some of our interests. Here's his quote. "In establishing the rule of law, the first 5 centuries are always the hardest." Okay, I'll finish my work while you take on the job of generating the question to which that's the answer. In providing support for a continuous stream of innovation that will make other real money, government money, infrastructure money, private money, more effective in helping the Great Lakes, the Protection Fund is a result of reaching out and convening expertise in a lot of fields and in a lot of stakeholder interests. Have prepared to outline the following 4 areas of special interest going forward. As always, as you read our guidelines, which are in your booklet there, you'll notice that our general guidelines mean we're open to all ideas and all requests from anybody at any time. Special areas of interest are just things that, in addition to receiving any great ideas that are coming our way, are things that experts have said, keep an eye on this stuff. Number 1, effects of climate change. Number 2, effects of industrial agriculture. Number 3, governing biological change. And number 4, upcoming demographic and economic shifts centering upon the valuation of water. So briefly, what does that stuff mean? Well, we're going to be trying to work creatively to build teams that can find solutions, things to try in the landscape that can lead toward larger, more effective, more efficient, high-value action by the folks, many of them in this room. The effects of industrial agriculture are well known to this group, and we're especially interested in supporting work that is going to result in new technologies and information systems that identify folks who are doing things well, business systems and models that are doing things well for the Great Lakes, and see that the market rewards them. This is going to result in such things as the ability to track and trace activity and product all the way through the value stream. When you're talking about phosphorus, you've got a product that leaves a mine, ends up in the public water supply. Who owns those molecules as they move from the mine into the public water supply, and how does that ownership responsibility never leave that product? Projects that look at getting those kind of market solutions and market assurance solutions active as soon as possible. The other thing in industrial agriculture, as we heard about this morning some, is the enormous increase in the subsurface drainage going on. Now, probably the largest alteration of the flow regime of the waters of the Great Lakes ecosystem is the result of massive increases in subsurface drainage that delivers water and whatever the water is containing in an unmanaged system very rapidly, and now in response to climate change, the variability of water inputs into the system and the great flashiness of the system means that this new infrastructure is probably going to be dominating water quality and water quantity issues for much of the ecosystem. So we're looking for ways, and there's some fascinating work already underway. You'll see some project teams we're supporting are looking at what kind of technology and software applications can lead toward the management of drainage systems operating as a system, not operating as unmanaged drains. Second topic is biological choice. In the past, we've been involved in invasive species questions, which have increasingly been explained to us as part of a larger question, which is, what is the desired biological composition of the Great Lakes, In other words, what species or what species attributes and traits do we want in the Great Lakes, knowing that we are now increasingly going to have the ability through genetic engineering to make those changes? How are those choices, getting to yes and getting to no, going to be made? To what criteria and by what process? Demographic and economic change is interesting stuff. This is all across the world now. Folks are looking at how do we value and account for water? How do we trace the way that the value of water flows through the system? We are interested in looking, not picking the winners of the variety of concepts that are going to be in contest in this regard, as to how especially public money is steered when there's less public money and much more infrastructure need, but rather how can we test some of these conceptual models in real places at real time to begin learning real fast how the valuation of water is going to add real value and add monetary value in this system. I'm done. I'm ready for a question. One key question followed by any content questions you really have.
Russ, thank you for your framing comments. As always, I think we could have, and we often do, have long conversations about any number of these issues. We do have just a couple of minutes for one or two questions from the commissioners at this point, but I do urge all of you to have follow-up conversations with Russ, both here on the commission as well as our observers. The work of the portfolio work of the Protection Fund has always been of great value to the basin and really understanding some of the contextual questions that you pose. So with that, I'll turn it over if our commissioners have any specific questions. Ohio.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you for your comments, and I do believe the one topic that you touched on, it really doesn't have anything to do with industrial farming, but it has to do with farming in general, small, medium, large. But subsurface drainage is something we need to address, we need to look at. In Ohio, we're looking at drainage control structures, using a lot of the money to actually shut a gate and try to keep a lot of the moisture in the land and when you need it. In August, we had a wet year in Ohio, as much of the Midwest, and again, we were praying for rain in August. So that's the way it usually is. But I believe that is one thing we need to look at. For many, many years, it's been the rule of thumb that phosphorus doesn't move. Go ahead and bank it. But I believe with the subsurface drainage and the ability for anyone to put it in, not just call a ditching company to ditch your farm. Now you just go to a local implement dealer and buy a ditching plow and do it yourself. And so this is something I think, I agree with you, been saying it for years, probably the biggest change in agriculture over the years. That and the use of some herbicides that we're now using, that everybody's using, are the two things we really need to look on the agricultural side of it. So not really a question, but a comment.
Excellent comment.
Just to follow up very briefly, I think, as you know, understanding how to manage hydrology in a hydrologically dominated system certainly matters as we talk about from Duluth all the way to Quebec. It is a connected system, and really understanding the manifestations of that in an altered hydrologic system is going to be one of the most compelling questions that we face, moving from sort of managing water in a place to managing water across its hydrology, I think is an area for some deep exploration, both on the economic side as well as on the policy side. Russ, I'll ask you a quick question. So as Montreal heads into its 375th anniversary, Detroit's a city of over 300 years, Sault Ste. Marie's a little bit older than that. We're well into our third century of industrialized European settlement. But what does that mean for you? You talked about the first 5 centuries as being tough. Where does that take us on governance over the next century to century and a half as we really look towards what the power and the value of the Great Lakes will be? How do you look that far ahead?
Thank you, John.
And you have 45 seconds to answer.
Yeah, 45 seconds will do it too, because the kind of observations that we're making on a number of topics now come down to this, is that we've pretty well gotten past the notion that we are conquering a natural ecosystem. It's a managed system now, and the hydrology is being managed invisibly and not at system scale, and not with a thought to what ability does the ecosystem have to feed back information to individual aggregated managers on what kind of decisions, what kind of behavior change does the system need in order to provide the best value back to its inhabitants. And it's exactly the same thing on the biology.
Right.
It's not just about keeping invasives out, it's deciding now that we can and will manage the biological composition, how do we reach those governance decisions? How do we change our governance so that it's evolving with the rate of change of the evolution of our ability to manage? So that when we come up with standards and we come up with processes for applying them, we don't try to craft them in stone. It's like you did with the Great Lakes Compact. You said every 5 years we review, do we need to rethink what the standards are and how we apply it? And so we're going to be doing that on the physical, the biological, and the chemical operation of our shared ecosystem. And the question is, how do we govern ourselves getting the best feedback from the system in real time?
So
45 seconds?
It's a wonderful question and a wonderful way to end this session. I do want to move on with our next, but it's a theme that we're going to come back to later in the afternoon as Tim and I reflect a little bit on what the future of the commission is and some of the kinds of challenges that are facing us well down the road. So thank you for teeing that up for us, and thank you for your service to the Great Lakes and to the Protection Fund as well on behalf of all of our executives. So thank you for that.